Hello, everybody. I'm Martina Schwartza. I have before me a very interesting opportunity. I have a number of very interesting questions, and I'm going to use those questions as a basis to talk about Zarathustra, that is to say, the founder of Zoroastrianism. I'll say a few words about Zoroastrianism in general also. Ordinarily, I pick a topic and go on from there. But in fact, that I have these questions gives me a very good opportunity to expound on some matters of Zarathustra and his poetry and significance of that poetry, which ordinarily I wouldn't have before me. So I'm going to then speak about Zarathustra and his poems, which are the Gathas, 17 poems, which are arranged metrically in groups of 5 called the Gathas, but there are 17 poems. And of those poems, in fact, I'm going to start with a question, or really a group of questions, about one of those 17 poems, which in the numbering of the later liturgy is called Yasna 32. There are only 17 poems. Yasna 32 tells us nothing as far as the number 32 is concerned about its order, for that matter. For example, the poem called Yasna 46 is older than Yasna 32. That numbering is a matter that I won't get into, apart from having said that it means nothing with regard to sequencing. So Yasna 32, it is the most complicated poem in the corpus, and to me, my favorite, because it is so intricate and has so many rich ideas and is poetically so packed intellectually that I find it a marvel. In fact, I find the Gathas in general one of the greatest intellectual and you can say spiritual products of all of humanity. Keep in mind that these poems were oral literature. They were not written until much, much later, centuries, many centuries later, when people began to forget, because writing had been around now for centuries, that it was written down in a very specially devised alphabet, which is also used for the rest of the Avesta. So the Gathas form the oldest part of the heterogeneous collection that we call the Avesta. Now, let us remember that this is poetry, and it comes from a tradition which the poet was prized for what he could show of his ability through language, through complex language, through intricate, interesting language. When one of the translators uses a phrase, tell me truly, tell me straight, or a straight talk, that's not it. I mean, sorry, it really means tell me rightly, tell me truly, but not straight. There's very little straight in the Gathas. there are some chief messages that are repeated, that are clear. They're repeated in variations. But there is, apart from these very clear, very overt messages, there is a lot of intricacy. There is a kind of encoding, even, of certain ideas. Now, in order to understand the Gathas, we have to employ a combination of techniques. Firstly, we have to know Vedic Sanskrit to translate it. Then there are a number of Iranian languages that shed light on the ancient vocabulary that we're dealing with. Some of them sound quite exotic in name. For example, Khwarezmian, Sogdian, Bactrian, Khotanisaka. There's a modern language that I found occasionally relevant called Ossetic, which, as you know, is spoken in the Caucasus. And of course, Pahlavi, which is Middle Persian, Zoroastrian Middle Persian, which in fact was used to gloss the Avesta. Although by the time you have the Sasanians and the Pahlavi tradition of glossation, people no longer understood the Gathas, apart from some words that they understood. So these are all things that are very complex. What one does with a word that seems unattested elsewhere, when one has the possibility of several readings in our manuscripts, which to choose. In addition to that, I've discovered several compositional approaches. The concentricity, the concentric structure of the poems, how each poem is related to the rest of the corpus, so one could set up a flow chart. One can show the poems that are especially closely related, and this works remarkably mechanically. I can produce and have produced many, many charts to show the interrelationship of the poems. Plus, as I say, there's also a cryptic dimension, a hidden dimension, which involves the use of sounds in certain combinations. So that helps us understand these poems, which are the most difficult to translate in all of literature. So let me then start with Yasna 32. Someone asked a question about Yasna 32, verse 8. Does it involve the killing of a cow? Is Yima claiming to be a god? What is that all about? Well, this is a good question because it gets us into an example of the difficulty of translation. And I'll take one verse, one stanza actually, and I'll read you some translations of it, and you'll see how different each translation is. Then I'll tell you what I think is going on in that poem. So let me start. Can you all hear me okay? Yeah. Good. This is Maria Wilkins Smith. She follows the translations of the great early 20th century scholar Christian Bartholomé. And so in effect, you have Bartholomé's rendering of Yasna 32:8 into English. passage? Oh, I did mark the passage. As guilty of these sins, the son of Wykład, who was known even Yima, who was desirous of satisfying men, causing our people to eat pieces of ox flesh. Apart from such as these, I am at thy dividing through wisdom hereafter. It's a little strange, but the upshot is, I mean, in detail, it's a little strange, but the clear aspect of the translation is that there was a certain Yima who gave portions of an ox for people to eat. That translation occurs in variations through various translators. However, let me give you Insler's version, which I think many of you must have seen. That's the 32:8. Even Yima, the son of Wykład, was tried for these sins, so he underwent a trial. He who wanted to satisfy our men by swearing, the cow is goddess. If I too am guilty of these sins, wise one, lies in thy judgment. So here, suddenly we have a cow, not an ox, and the cow is goddess. I don't think that the point is that there was a goddess who was the cow. There are grammatical reasons to think that that's not the case. And it's something that's not supported by the rest of the text. Perhaps the late Professor Insler had in mind the worship of the golden calf or something like that in the Old Testament. I don't know. Anyway, that is Insler. I have also Martin West, the late Martin West. Alas, so many of our GATHY scholars have died in recent years, and Professor West, who late in his career produced a GATHY translation, says as follows. For such offenses, Wykład's son was renowned, even Yima, who sought to gratify our mortal race by feeding them portions of the cow. As to these deeds, I rest on thy decision, mindful one. So that is pretty much the cow business. Now, finally, or not almost finally, I'll read you the last 2010 translation of the late Helmut Humbach in his book, Zarathustra and His Antagonists. Even Yima, the son of Wykład, is notorious for one of such outrages. Even he who tried to satisfy us humans and our animals with the injunction that business of animals is in parentheses, Humbach inserts that idea. Meat is just part of a complete meal. Without the parentheses, meat is a part of a meal. Now, the instance of Humbach is very interesting because this is a scholar who, over the years, produced various translations of the Gathas. This was his last. An earlier one, in which I think he got everything, well, almost right, says as follows. He states it in German. Let's see. Deren Bestreben, die Menschen zufriedenzustellen, das sei gefällig zu sein, dass unsere, die unsere sich versündigte, indem mit Gott rechnete. Just something like, in his striving to satisfy people, namely ours, he, namely Yima, sinned since he contested with God, tried to be rival to God. Now, I think that that translation is actually, as I said, on the way to being correct. What you have is a bunch of words in one sentence whose translation is dependent on a very close look at the grammar to see what's not possible, and giving to eat is not possible. The word that's translated variously is cow or ox, gauche, could be, as Humbach himself said, a word meaning to go astray, to fall short of a goal, to sin. One can say a great deal about that. And the word baga, which some people thought meant portions, seems to be with God, or with a God. And I think what this amounts to is that Yima was either famous or was heard or underwent trial. All of those possibilities are there. He who wished to requite, to propitiate, you can say to satisfy, but there's a reciprocal nuance there, to propitiate our people. And Professor Gershevich thought actually these are words that Yima himself said. Merely trying to propitiate our people was his excuse. With a God, by swearing thereby with a God, to satisfy them with a God. It's as though they wanted a God to worship. He satisfied them, swearing, speaking falsely at the same time. Now, there's an old tradition about Yima speaking a false word. We have that in one of the Yashts. The entirety of Yasna 32 speaks about false gods, false speech, and this would combine the two. Yima's presenting himself as a god through false speech. So what is the context of that, you might ask? Because it would be desirable that each of the poems be cohesive. That is a fault that I find with all the translations. They just don't cohere. And the relationship between one stanza and the other isn't obvious from the translations. I maintain that they should cohere, and they do cohere, but it takes some doing to see that cohesion. Someone asks a question about Hauma, this ritual liquid. Yes, does 32:14, same poem, verse 14, show disapproval of Hauma, this ritual liquid that was pressed with a mortar? That's what the word Hauma means. I say that Yasna 32, one of its important themes is Hauma, and yet the word Hauma is not visible in the text. Part of the reason it's not visible in the text, actually the main reason, is that Zarathustra did not want to give life to beings, to entities that he did not like. He did not want to perpetuate them through his poetry. So that you don't even find the formulation, Angra Manu, the wicked spirit, let's call it, in the Gathas. It's known from the later Avesta. He uses the word Angra and the word Manu in various combinations, and instead of Angra, wicked, he could say Akka, bad, the Akka Manu, that he could do. Or of those spirits, the one who was the worst, or the one who was better, but he, with regard to the opposite spirit. But there's no mention, for the reason I just told you. Similarly, he doesn't mention other divinities of whom he disapproved. Now, we know that there were gods with a great antiquity. They go back to Indo-Iranian times, to the time of the unity of the people who eventually became the Vedic culture in India and the Central Asiatic Iranians, gods who go back to that period, such as Mitra in Vedic, Vayu, Apamnapat, and various other divinities. They're not mentioned in the Gathas. They do occur later in the Avesta, and I think what happened is that for whatever reason, either because Zarathustra's followers felt they needed the old gods to maintain their popularity, or, as I think is more likely, the priesthood of the old gods somehow co-opted Zarathustra's message, said, we have no problem with Mazda Ahura. We've always been worshippers of Mazda Ahura. Who is this Zarathustra anyway? Does he think he's God? And with the passage of time, gradually they restored the old worship in a kind of synthesis together with Zarathustra's ideas. The interesting thing is, I believe that Zarathustra foresaw this. He was concerned about it. And he mentions this possibility within Yasna 32, that his message and his messengers will be misused, will be thwarted by the worshippers of what he calls the Daiwas. Now, I'm asked a question about the Daiwas. Daiwa is an ancient word, Indo-Iranian word, which means a divinity. Originally, it means a bright one, heavenly one. We know the Vedic culture used it. We know that another culture in that area, linguistically and otherwise related to both the Vedic and the Iranian culture, who survived in a way in Afghanistan, in the province of Nuristan. In the last century, they were called Kafirs because they were not Muslims. They also had daiwas. And I wrote an article a while back which showed that the worship, the practices of these Nuristani types were known in the Gathas and described as enemy practices. So they had that word daiwa, and they had a number of other words that are deprecated, that are pejorative in the Avesta. Not in their language, but it is clear that Zarathustra, and probably before him, Iranians dismissed some of the ideas of their ethnic rivals in that area. So Daiwa in itself, before Zarathustra, and I can show this, it's complicated, but I can show this, give you a little idea of how I can show it in the course of time. Daiwa, for Iranian, before Zarathustra, meant a demon, not a god. They took the word that the others used for God and turned it into a demon. Just as one of the demons we know mentioned in the Avesta is Indra, God among the Proto-Nuristani people and among the Vedic people, name of a god, and others. So Zarathustra, not wishing to name the gods of whom he didn't approve, whom in his opinion weren't gods anyway, he called them the demons. That way he didn't have to mention them. Now, that will cover demons. As for Hauma, the reason Yima is in this text, I was going to tell you, is because Zarathustra knew a hymn to Hauma. That hymn to Hauma still survives in the Avesta. It occurs in Yasna 9 and Yasna 10, what is often called the Haum Yasht, the Yasht to Hauma, or Hom Yasht to use the Middle Persian word. I can prove that Zarathustra knew an early form of this poem, a poem honoring Hauma by the traditional worshippers of Hauma, took its vocabulary and turned it on its head. He does so, in fact, in Yasna 32, verse 10. He says what sounds like, that person indeed makes language or makes words go wrong, and so forth. Hauma na srawa moindat. Hauma, that guy, moreover, is a wordplay on Hauma. So he is saying, through Hauma, someone perverts, the man perverts language and does a number of other misdeeds. He who says that the worst one or that the worst thing is to see, he swears that the worst thing or the worst one is to see the cow and sun with his evil eyes. There's a word that doesn't mean the eye of envy, but it's just a pejorative word for eye. That was an okay word among the Vedic and Proto-Nuristani people, and so forth and so on, who would lift a weapon against the righteous one. Now, in this verse, Yasna 32:10, there are a number of words that occur in a very short portion and sequence toward the end of Yasna 9, namely, Waina, to see, Gam Ashibya, the cow with eyes, the cow with one's eyes, Wadar, a weapon, occurs only in this text and in the Hamyasht. Wajda, to lift, Ashaune, against the righteous. The original context and the original syntax of this is different, but Zarathustra turns things on its head and says that these are the evil people. These are the ones who call the righteous the wrongful ones. And so he plays a kind of word jazz to those who knew the Hamyasht. They knew what he was doing. He does mention Hauma, but in a wordplay. And in that text, Yasna 9, Yima and his father are mentioned because Yima's father was the mythological first person to press Hauma. And Zarathustra uses Wiwahwant and his son, and he has all kinds of interesting word plays to show that they were both useless in effect. I could give a lecture, and I think I did give a lecture actually on just that, but that is one of the reasons that Yima is at all mentioned in this text, because he's part of that Hauma complex. Okay, let me pass from Yasna 32, that most remarkable of compositions, a composition which begins with an interesting riddle. If you read my article in the Wiley-Blackwell Companion to Zoroastrianism, I discuss that there. As a matter of fact, that is one article that I recommend you read. And I can give you a few other articles. One is called A Preliterate, Preliterate, acrostic in the Gathas. That will tell you a lot about Zarathustra's cryptic techniques and how one can study them systematically through these compositional keys that I mentioned a while back. Now, let's then talk about, let's just say one more thing about Daiwas. Some scholars have assumed that it was Zarathustra himself who took the word Daiwa and demonized it from God to demon, but that's not the case. My wife helpfully passed a note saying, so who exactly is Yima? Not a god, not a demon, a drunkard, a tribal chief? No. We know that there was a figure who was a god in the Veda. He's called Yama. Among the Nuristani peoples, he survives in a neighboring group in Pakistan as Yimare, King Yama. So he was a god in Indo-Iranian. There are a lot of stories about him, and he has a manifold nature, but we know that in Iran he was worshipped as a god because in the coinage of northern Afghanistan within the early Christian era, in which we find on one side of the coin the image of a god, we find a figure who is called, in effect, Yama on the coin. And we know names of people in Sogdiana and in Bactria where Yama figures as a divine name, just as we say, let's say, given by this or that god, like Theodore, gift of God. You have gift of Yema, given by Yema. So we know he was a god. And for Zarathustra, he swore that he was a god. This was his sin. This is the way Zarathustra dealt with the myth. So thanks for that question about Yema. I sometimes forget to explain things, and that was helpful.
Did you explain what Hauma is, besides being?
Did I explain what Hauma is? Good question. Hauma means a substance which is pressed in a mortar. It's not a botanical name. The question is, what was Hauma? I think there were two plants that were used, originally concurrently, sometimes together, sometimes in alternation, that were pressed in a mortar. I co-wrote a book about that subject, somewhat outdated now, but I still stick, as does my co-author David Flattery, a book called Hauma and Harmelin, Flattery and Schwartz, in which we identified the psychoactive Hauma as the juice of a plant called botanically Paganum harmala, harmel in English in short, and this produces psychotropic results. It's not necessarily a euphoriant. It can produce horrible visions. It can produce diarrhea and vomiting. And I thought that in Yasna 48, those adverse effects are mentioned, those adverse effects of Hauma. And it would seem that Hauma was a rival source of authority. We know that the adherents of the Hauma cult promised bliss from Hauma. Zarathustra said, no, bliss is something you get from Mazdahura as a reward for piety. And it seems that Zarathustra managed to make people give up the use of this ritual drug, which provided a kind of access to the other world, but had for Zarathustra terrible drawbacks, and replaced it by the other plant, ephedra, which is not psychotropic. If you boil it, and only if you boil it, it's something of a nervous stimulant, but if you just press it in a mortar, nothing. Looks something like Paganum harmala, so it was a good substitute. That's the plant that Zoroastrian priests now use for home. So,
is there a connection between Yema and Hauma? No.
I've been saying a number of times Mazda Ahura instead of Ahura Mazda. That is the more common order in the Gathas. There was a question as to the words Mazda and Ahura and their gender. Mazda comes from an underlying word meaning wisdom, but it is the one masculine who is wise. So it takes the word wisdom and it masculinizes it and makes it the property of someone, not just a thing in itself. Ahura means Lord. And in fact, there are different Ahuras in the Gathas. The chief one was the Ahura who is Mazda, who is either wise or wisdom, knowing or knowledge, you could also say. Understanding is better. And Ahura, the Lord. Other divinities are also called lords. There are three chief divinities who are all one divinity, and this gets us to the question of, are we dealing with a monotheism? Can we speak of a monotheism? Is it a monotheism? In what sense? Is monotheism versus polytheism the right way to talk about these matters? That is, in fact, one of the tenets, a kind of mystical tenet of the Gathas. Mazda Ahura is one, but can be spoken of and addressed through various aspects, the chief being Artha Wahishta, rightness or the best rightness, and Wahumana, good mind. So these form a kind of triad. I wouldn't say a trinity, because there are some other abstractions that sometimes figure, but these three are the most common and are a virtual triad in the Gathas, almost a trinity, but an open-ended trinity. The word one with regard to Ahura Mazda does not occur. The monotheistic religions that are famous for us in history, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity. Christianity is a little problematic precisely because of Trinitarianism, but the Christian creed says we believe in one God. That's the main thing there. Judaism, here Israel, the Lord is one, the Lord is God. Islam, there is no God but Allah. And this idea of the oneness of God is a central message overtly in all of these religions. Now, it happens that the people who studied the history of religion were all of this tradition, mostly Christians. And so they came up with the word monotheism. But that is a difficult word because who is calling it monotheistic, the outsider or the insider? Well, with Islam, with Christianity, with Judaism, clearly the insider does. But with the Gathas, there is no message that there's only one God. There's rather a message that there is a divinity who has different aspects that whom Zarathustra addresses in the same line as thou, singular, and you, plural. And so is Zarathustra a monotheist? Yes and no. He preferred to have a different emphasis, namely, one aspect of divinity is, let's say, mind, another is rightness, but it's still the same divinity. And those are aspects of divinity that we can integrate, that are also for us. We have a wahumana. We have a spirit of rightness. We have a feeling of rightness. I think that that is an important aspect of the theology of the Gathas. With regard to monotheism versus dualism, there's no real verses there. There's no opposition in the Gathas between Ahura Mazda and Angra Mainyu. What you have is two spirits, one which is holy and one which is wicked or destructive, harmful. Where do these come from? And what are their relation to Mazda Ahura? Well, they are impetus, they are animus, they are driving forces. One is creative, one is destructive. According to Zarathustra, each spirit chose its nature. One chose rightness, the other chose wrongness. These were pre-existent poles of being. There's no mention as to where rightness and wrongness came from, but they were objects of choice. These are not beings really in the world. They're not material. They're immaterial. And the word manyua, for Manu, in the Western means immaterial, intangible. I think that Manu was a complicated notion. We see in the Rig Veda, Manu can be anger, especially the anger of a god. It's the related word in ancient Greek, and of course these are related languages, they're Indo-European languages. Among other things is menis. Menis is wrath, which like Manu in the Veda can be fiery, anger. That's a curious thing. The root, to put simply, is the Indo-European root men, which means to think. But think is not it. It is a force that arises within the mind and animates one. And this is why, curiously enough, that root men you have in the Greek word mania, which means craziness. Mainomai in ancient Greek means I act wildly, I act crazily, because it refers to this men force as an excess in its extreme force. So, yeah, the men force has me look at the clock and we're moving, I see, rather quickly. But an excess of men force and I get wild, I begin grabbing everything and going nuts. So there are two aspects, especially to the word manu, as an impetus. And Zarathustra separated them. This is my historical explanation of Manu. One could wish to say that he had a divine insight about this, and that is the kind of statement that is beyond what I can say. I can just say what Zarathustra tells us. So let us see. So according to my analysis of Yasna 30, Mazda Ahura is a latency within Spenta Manu. It's there within Spenta Manu, as it were, emerges into the world from Spenta Manu as Lord, as a worshipable entity, and is part of existence, not separate from existence. And then probably creates Wahumana and Asha, because Mazda Ahura is said to be the father of Asha, and remains an aspect of Mazda Ahura, even though Mazda Ahura, as it were, emerges from Spenta Manu. But this separation of the original scenario of a difference between Spenta Manu, the holy Manu, and Angra Manu, the harmful Manu, means that Mazda is not responsible for evil in the world. It comes out of Angra Mainyu. The formulation that has God versus devil, Mazda versus Angra Mainyu, is a later formulation. You find it within later Zoroastrian texts, and you find it mentioned in Greek texts, perhaps as early as Aristotle, but it's not a Gothic formulation. So the problem of evil is not the problem of God having to do with God the way it is in the monotheistic religions. Someone asked about the disapproval of killing a cow. There are two places in Yasna 32 where the evil priests are rebuked for killing the cow. Exactly who the cow is, what the cow is, I don't know, but I think now in those contexts, it really represents a sacrificed cow. One cannot generalize that Zarathustra was against slaughter of cattle, but certainly slaughter of cattle as part of the rite of Halma is a waste of life for Zarathustra. That much is clear, I think. As far as the symbolism, greater symbolism of the cow, I once wrote an article in which I endeavored to show that the soul of the cow is Spenta Manus, the Holy Spirit. You can find that article. It's called Gothic Composition, Yasna 29, and Bovine Symbolism. I don't know what I say about that these days. Well, I don't say anything about that these days. That was then. Professor Schmidt, who came up with this idea in the first place, and in whose honor I wrote this article, the late Lasse Hans-Peter Schmidt. After I wrote my article, he said, well, I don't know why. For all I know, this is Wokumana after all. Okay. Well, I don't know either, but you can read what I thought then. And as I say, I no longer am sure, but I don't know if I'm going to take this up again, this question. Perhaps I should. There's Yasna 47, which is all about Spenta Manu. It's a short poem, only 7 stanzas. But I have to look at that more carefully to see what is going on with Spenta Manu. I haven't done that. I've been putting that off. Light and darkness has been exaggerated as symbols in the Gathas. There is in Yasna 44 the mention of light and darkness created by Mazdahura, just as things of nature. Light of morning is when we wake up, start the day by worshiping. Night is when we sleep. They're both fine. If you look at that poem, Yasna 44, however, in terms of its structure, it may be that there's a verse that speaks of 2 armies that are opposed, that are, with regard to the concentric composition of the poem, correspond to this business of light and darkness. So I think light and darkness works both naturally and symbolically in the Gathas. Where you do have light versus darkness clearly is in the description of heaven and hell. Heaven is bright, hell is dark. But I think the business of light versus darkness is a misconception due to the confusion that people have had between Zoroastrianism and Manichaeism. which is dualistic, but which is a very different kind of dualism. Someone asked me about Frawashis. They don't occur in the Gathas. It's an aspect of one's being. It pre-exists and it post-exists people, but Zarathustra does not use that word Frawashi. Does anyone wish to ask me a question now? There are just a few minutes, really just a few minutes, but I will take one or two questions if someone wishes. Otherwise, if you like, we can arrange another Zoom session, and we can have a dialogue. I like dialogues. It keeps me active. It gives me ideas. I profit from questions. And I miss the fact that because of my time constraint, I decided not to take questions. But for now, are there any questions in a couple of minutes that remain?
Thank you very much, dear Professor, for all your explanations. We are honored to listen to you. My question is about the metrum, because one of our friends asked us, yes, metrum in the Gathas.
Yeah, you mean the prosody, the meter, yeah?
Yeah, exactly. Meter, yeah.
Excuse me, Martin.
Pardon
What he mean is the.
You mean the construction of the verses?
Exactly. Exactly.
Yes.
The prosody, yeah. Yes, there are essentially 5 prosodic patterns of the Gathas. That is the way the Gathas are divided. One also has to do with length of the stanza, but essentially it's a matter of meter. So you have poems in the pattern bum, 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 bum. And in the middle is what we call the caesura, which divides the verse in 2. Or we have 7 and 9. And there are various other patterns, magical patterns. What about the meter? Well, what shall I say about the meter? What did he want to know about the meter?
And the last question.
No, I mean, did I answer the question about meter? Yes, it's metrical poetry.
Yes.
So is all ancient Indo-European poetry.
Is he interested in how they chanted and how they structured?
So what can you say more about the question? What question specifically had about meter, or has my answer satisfied it?
This answer is satisfying to me, but it's like we have these Greek names of meters, like diatonic and others. We have some names for Gathas metric or something like this. It's like dactyl meter. I don't remember. Is that in Polish we have dactyl for
This is
and iamb.
Yes, I understand. Iambs, dactyls, so forth. One difference between Gothic meter and, on the one hand, and say Vedic and Greek meter on the other, is length of syllables. Essentially, you just have a syllable count in the Gathas. So generally, there's a break in each line, and you have so many syllables and so many syllables on each side of the break, but not a matter of long versus short. So iambic, the dan, the dan, the dan, the dan. No. The dan, short, long, short, long. No, you don't have short, long, long, short in the Gathas.
Okay, so only number of syllables of something.
Yeah.
Okay.
Syllable.
Understand. Thank you.
Yeah, one could talk a long time about that, but anything else?
Yeah, just last question. I think, what do you think, Professor? Can Zoroastrianism exist just based on the gathas, as proposed also by Martin Hauck in 19th century, and still now many people are saying now that?
I think in California, the late Dr. Jafari
exactly
led people in such a view. I have nothing to say about that. That's a matter of faith. Can one, in theory, sure. If you want a religion which is the Gothic religion, fine, but there's no ritual. I don't believe as against what some of my colleagues say. I don't think there's any real ritual that's described in the Gathas. Not even the wearing of the sacred garment, sacred girdle. That comes out later. And, you know, there's a huge history of tradition of what calls itself Zoroastrianism. One of the oldest non-Gothic group of texts, the Yasta Haptan Haiti. One can found a wonderful ecological aspect of Zoroastrianism if one wished on those texts. They're not part of the Gathas, but they're very, very old. And they were informed by the Gathas. Or one can go around with sticks with 9 knots in the sticks and spear frogs as a pious action. Wherever you see a lizard or wherever you see a frog, that's also in the Avesta. You can, you know, so that's just an example of the contrast. There's a lot there. Someone asked me about homosexuality, pornography, abortion. Within Zoroastrianism, sure, Pahlavi texts strongly repudiate homosexuality. Nothing about it in the Gathas. Yasna 51, a person who did not give Zarathustra hospitality is called the Kawina Waipya. The word Waipya seems to mean a sodomist, active sodomist, but you can't build too much on that. It could have just been, it seems to be that that's the meaning of it. Just think he was putting down someone in a way that, well, may have been part of that culture. I mean, may not have been politically correct.
Very last question about
Yes.
which translation of Gathas into English or other language is the best in your opinion? It's a very difficult issue.
They're all faulty. I mean,
yeah.
Insler is reasonable, but some of the things he stresses, I mean, to me, Insler is reasonable, but he has, even though he was not himself a Protestant, he something Protestant theological about his approach to the Gathas. Humbach has very interesting philological insights, at least in 1992, Humbach, but I don't think the stuff is coherent and sometimes it's ridiculous. West kind of takes a little from here and takes a little from there, and you can read West's translation. I don't think it's much worse than the rest. It doesn't give you the life of the Gathas, which is an intricate, multivalent, has many, opens up the imagination to many possibilities. Brilliant composition. None of these translations give you the sense of the original. And so I don't know, you know, you can use Zinsler if you wish, you can use West if you wish, have a look at Humbach, have a look at all of them.
You have to send them your latest drafts of papers on screen. You have to send them your draft paper on manual. You have to send them which is yet not published.
Okay. So I think I had better for the time being. Thank you for your attention. And as I say, we can, if you like, have a session to discuss these and whatever other matters you wish. And so be in good health and success to all of you, and goodbye for now.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.